Hello YouTube, and welcome to another controller chaos. And so for today's video we have something incredibly unique. By incredibly unique I mean kinda weird. So on today's video I have with me the Suily Nintendo 64 controller. So right out the bat you guys might notice that this looks a little bit like the Retrobit Tribute 64, which in turn looked like the Horipad Mini Nintendo 64 controller. So what we have essentially here is a bootleg Horipad Mini / bootleg Tribute 64 controller. And based off my prior experiences with these Chinese knockoff bootleg controllers, I'm not really expecting a lot here. These things tend to be garbage and junk. So let's find out on today's video. Alright, so before I get into showing you guys what the controller looks like and how it feels and everything, I kind of want to just highlight this packaging that these controllers came in, because this has to be the cheapest packaging ever. Normally these things come in at least like a white box or sometimes a generic cardboard box, you know, something like that. This just straight up came in a bubble mailer with the controllers wrapped inside a bubble wrap, which, you know, is nice. Like, it will, generally speaking, protect the controllers, but it's just still funny to me, like, how cheap these things came in. And so, one nice thing, though, is you do get two of these controllers for, I guess, essentially the price of one. These controllers are 30 bucks each, but you get two of them. So, when you think about it that way, it's really $15 each, because you're buying two. But yeah, so just taking a quick look and everything at it, it's very clearly modeled after the Horipad Mini or the Retrobit Tribute 64. But there are a couple of differences. The first thing is, I think the D-pad is a little bit bigger on this one. It at least feels nicer to me than the Tribute 64 and the Horipad D-pad. And this one also feels like oddly bigger, even though they're roughly, you know, the same size roughly. This one's just a little bit taller, I suppose I would say. Yeah, just a little taller. So it feels a bit nicer in the hands because of that. The Tribute 64 and the Horipad Mini have always made my hands feel a little cramped. Not cramped to the point to where it's uncomfortable, but just a little bit. And then another difference is the shoulder buttons. This one obviously has a more modern shoulder button design. And this one went for more toward, I would say, the traditional design, where it's just a small button. So that's interesting. And then lastly is the cable length. These things only have around 3-foot cables, and these have 10-foot cables, which make them kind of better in that regard, because I don't like to use those cable extender things. But yeah, though, so those are the differences that I noticed outright. One thing that I have noticed is the stick on this is actually a bit tighter, which I kind of like, because I've always just preferred the bigger sticks, tighter sticks to looser feeling ones. And so I like that this one's a little bit tighter. And of course it has that whole, you know, GameCube hitting the octagonal gate sound and everything that, you know, anybody who plays with GameCube style controllers is familiar with. And it's a nice big thumbstick. Like, this feels really good. And so do the buttons and stuff. I really like these buttons, and the start and the shoulder triggers are great as well. And I even like the D-pad. The D-pad is a little stiff though, and not in like the thumbstick sense, in like the sense you don't want a D-pad to be stiff, but it still feels alright. So overall, like, first impressions of this controller in terms of just like the feel tests and everything, it's definitely feeling pretty good. So, you know, feeling out process is fine and all, but let's get into some games. Let's test this thing out. Let's put it through the ringer, and, you know, then we're going to our final thoughts. Alright, so the first game up that I decided to play with this controller was none other than Mario 64. I think Mario 64 is pretty much everyone's go-to test game for Nintendo 64, so it seemed like a good starting place. And I gotta say, like, everything about the controller is surprisingly good. Like, the buttons feel really nice. I'm doing all my jumps and everything like I normally would. And it just feels great in the hands. I'm surprised by the comfortability of this controller. Next up, I'm playing some Toy Story 2, and this is one of those games that I played as a kid and I loved it. Played it as a young adult, loved it. Playing it now, I love it. And this is one of those few N64 games, though, where if your thumbstick is either too sensitive or not sensitive enough, the first-person aiming, the laser first-person thing here, just won't work correctly. So, for instance, when I use the Tribute 64 controller, it just doesn't work correctly for some reason. But with this one, it works. But if you push too far on the thumbstick, like if you go all the way, it won't work. It'll keep you in the middle. But so as long as you don't do that, the laser will work perfectly fine, which is very interesting to me as it shows that this controller is not as sensitive as the Tribute 64 controller, which is a really good thing because that's one of my few complaints with the Tribute 64 is how sensitive the thumbstick is on that controller. Next up, I'm playing some WWF No Mercy, and while this isn't my favorite wrestling game of all time, I'm more of a Day of Reckoning guy myself, this is a great game to test D-pads on for Nintendo 64, because oddly enough, this game is one of those games that uses the D-pad, and I quite like the D-pad on this controller. It reminds me a bit of the Game Boy Advance D-pad. It's roughly the same size as the GBA's first model D-pad, and it's very clicky. Now, this might be a problem to some people because it is a bit on the stiffer side, and I know some people don't like stiff D-pads, but I think overall this is a very solidly made D-pad, and one of the better ones I've used on a Nintendo 64 controller. Finally, I'm playing some Sin and Punishment, because this is probably my favorite Nintendo 64 game overall, generally speaking, and it just feels right to play it on this controller. And it's Sin and Punishment. It plays like Sin and Punishment. It feels like Sin and Punishment. I really have to say I'm really impressed by the build quality of this controller. I've been using it as my main Nintendo 64 controller for the last week and a half, and the buttons still feel really solid. The thumbstick still feels really good. Everything on this controller is holding up very well, and that's after around a week and a half of play, which I know isn't the longest time to test or play with something, but you have to think, like, I've been using it as my main controller, so I've probably been playing at least like 3 hours a day using this controller, and it's still holding up. It still feels brand new, which is a really good indicator toward the quality of it. And I'm just really impressed by that quality because, as I said, normally these Chinese knockoff controllers are just total garbage and fail within like a day or two of getting them. Sometimes they don't even work when you get them brand new. The last thing I want to mention about this controller is the price of it. So as I said, it is $30 for this controller, but you have to think you're getting two controllers with this, so it's really only $15 per controller. And once again, if we compare that or contrast that to the Retro Bit Tribute 64, where it's $25 for only one, you can see how it's the better deal between the two. And then also it's $5, well, I guess technically $20 cheaper than the Brawler 64 Retro Fighters Trash Garbage Pad. So this controller is pretty cheap, all things considered, because you're getting two of them. So everything's looking really good for this controller, so we're going to go into my closing thoughts now. Alright, so final thoughts on the Suily, I think that's how it's pronounced, Nintendo 64 modern game controller Horipad Mini knockoff thing. I'm actually kind of stunned by this. When I bought this, I thought that this would be a pile of garbage, okay? Because I've used a decent handful of these cheap Chinese knockoff Nintendo 64 controllers in the past. Well, not even just Nintendo 64, but GameCube and whatnot. You guys can see one of my reviews for one of them, one of my previous reviews for one of them, in the inscription thing above, but that's neither here nor there. So I'm kind of stunned though, because this thing has a good build quality. It doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't feel like trash. The buttons feel really good. The thumbstick is a little bit tighter, which, as I noted, I like more. I prefer a tighter thumbstick to a looser one. The dead zone on this, or the inaccuracy on this on the thumbstick, isn't as bad as the Tribute 64, which kind of makes it better as well, because, you know, aiming your shot on certain games just is easier, and it's also easier for a newer or somebody who's more experienced, I suppose, with the Nintendo 64 to get used to and everything. The controller is also a little bit bigger, as was noted in the look down thing portion of this video. As was noted there, it is a little bit bigger, which also makes it more comfortable to hold. The D-pad, like I said, I think it is my favorite D-pad on the Nintendo 64. Just because, even though it's a little bit on the stiffer side, it just feels good. It reminds me of the Game Boy Advance D-pad, like I said. And that's about it. Lastly, I guess, would be the price. These are $30, but you get 2 of them. So it's really only $15 per controller. And, like, that's a great deal, in my opinion, for these controllers. Because when we're talking about these modern controllers, these modern controllers for retro systems, I always kind of feel like I'm getting ripped off, because back in the day, you know, an OEM Nintendo 64 controller was only $20. And, you know, these newer companies and everything, like, these parts are harder to find and whatnot, but it's not like they cost more to manufacture and distribute. So this only being $30 and you getting 2 of them, in my opinion, like, 100%, like, makes this the best or the easiest to recommend Nintendo 64 controller on the market currently, which is kind of stunning to me, because I really expected nothing from this. Like, I expected this thing to be utter garbage. So anyways, that's going to do it for the Suily Nintendo 64 generic game controller thing. Overall, I really like it. You know, I think it's going to be my go-to Nintendo 64 controller going forward. But I'm going to link this product's Amazon page in the description below, and you guys can check it out. You know, let me know what you guys think. Do you guys think that this controller is a hunk of garbage, or do you guys think it's really good like me as well? Let me know in the comments below. Subscribe, like, all that good stuff, all that big YouTuber energy stuff, and peace.